You think you know what really happened behind closed doors, but the story you were told may be the one thing keeping the truth hidden, because what went down in that penthouse meeting was not about protection or concern, and leaked testimony is now exposing a completely different motive. And just as those details are about to surface publicly, a sudden media move raises a massive red flag. So stay with me, because once you hear what was actually said and how it mysteriously ended up in the press, this entire narrative starts to fall apart. You would think that when a husband storms into a private penthouse meeting to confront a director, it would be about protecting his wife, about standing up for her safety, about drawing a clear line in the sand, but that is not what happened. And the more depositions that surface, the clearer it becomes that this meeting was not about concern, it was about control and power and ego. And that realization changes everything, because once you understand what that meeting really was, you start to see why the narrative being pushed publicly looks nothing like what actually happened behind closed doors. And that is where the story truly begins, because while headlines told the public one version, sworn testimony paints a very different picture, and it is a picture that certain people seem increasingly desperate to keep from fully coming into focus. Which is why what happened next matters so much, because just as pressure was building, just as questions were piling up, just as contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore, a brand new move was made outside the courtroom, and it was not subtle, it was strategic. It was loud, and it was clearly designed to send a message not to a judge but to the media and to the public. And that move was the sudden hiring of a high-profile attorney known not for courtroom litigation in this case, but for shaping narratives and controlling headlines. And notably, this information did not first appear in a court filing. It appeared in a glossy celebrity magazine, complete with exclusive quotes, perfectly framed language, and carefully chosen comparisons that immediately set off alarm bells for anyone paying close attention, because when legal teams go public before they go to court, it usually means they are bracing for something they cannot control. And the language used in that article was not neutral, it was emotional, it was loaded, it was designed to associate one story with another, far more serious category of harm, without actually having to prove anything in court. And that is a powerful tactic, especially in the court of public opinion, and it is one that only becomes necessary when evidence is thin but exposure risk is high. And what makes this moment even more revealing is that this was not a lone attorney joining an understaffed team. This was an addition to an already massive legal operation, which raises the obvious question: why now? Why this attorney? Why this framing? And why leak it to the press before formally notifying the court? And the answer seems increasingly clear. The walls are closing in, and upcoming disclosures threaten to contradict the public story that has been carefully curated for months, because beneath the headlines, beneath the interviews, beneath the carefully worded statements, there are sworn accounts from people who were actually in the room. And those accounts do not align with the heroic narrative that has been sold, and that disconnect is exactly what makes this so volatile, because once juries, judges, or even the general public start noticing inconsistencies, trust erodes fast. And trust once lost is nearly impossible to regain. And that is why the penthouse meeting matters so much, because it was supposed to be the emotional centerpiece of the public story. The moment where righteous anger met justified protection, except according to testimony. That meeting was something else entirely. It was hours long, it was aggressive, it was humiliating, and according to witnesses, it was not driven by specific complaints or requests for solutions. It was driven by demands for submission, demands for apology without explanation, demands for compliance. And that distinction is critical, because it reframes everything, and it also explains why multiple attempts during questioning to redirect the motive back to concern for safety repeatedly failed, because the people under oath did not confirm that framing, no matter how many times they were asked. And when sworn testimony refuses to support a narrative, that narrative becomes fragile. And when a narrative becomes fragile, media management becomes urgent, which brings us right back to why this new attorney suddenly appeared in a magazine spread instead of a motion filing. Because this is not about arguing law, this is about stabilizing perception ahead of information that could destabilize everything. And viewers should pay close attention to timing here, because timing tells the truth even when words do not. And what is coming next is not speculation, it is already outlined in sworn exchanges, where lawyers push witnesses to say something, and witnesses simply refuse to say it. And that refusal speaks louder than any headline, because when someone has every opportunity to confirm a story and chooses not to under oath, that silence becomes evidence in itself. And this is where the suspense deepens, because if that meeting was not about what the public was told, then what else has been misrepresented? And if that misrepresentation made its way into major publications during an agreed-upon pause in media engagement, Then how did those details get out and who benefited from their release? And that question leads directly into the next chapter of this story, where private words somehow became public talking points, where humiliation described in testimony later appeared as anonymous praise in print, and where a truce was allegedly broken without consequences, at least publicly, and that trail leads to a reporter whose role in the saga has become increasingly complicated, whose statements have shifted, whose legal representation keeps changing, and whose position now raises as many questions as it answers. And that is not coincidence, it is pattern, and patterns matter. Because patterns reveal intent, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And everything that follows starts to make unsettling sense, and this is only the beginning of how that pattern unfolds. The reason this next part matters so much is because once you accept that the penthouse meeting was not what it was publicly framed to be, everything that happened afterward suddenly snaps into focus like dominoes falling in slow motion, because information does not leak randomly, narratives do not appear out of thin air, and media stories do not conveniently surface during supposed truces, unless someone wants them there. And that is where the next layer of this story becomes impossible to ignore, because according to sworn testimony, one of the most humiliating and aggressive claims made in that meeting was never intended for public consumption, and yet somehow it appeared almost word for word in a major international outlet at the exact moment when public perception was shifting. And that coincidence is doing a lot of work here, because when someone says under oath that a statement made privately later appeared in the press during a no-contact period, that is not gossip. That is a factual sequence of events, and sequences matter, especially when they repeat. And what was reportedly said during that meeting, according to deposition testimony, was not just criticism but a declaration that the entire project was a failure, that it had been rescued, that it only survived because of outside intervention. And that kind of statement does more than insult, it undermines credibility, it reframes authorship, and it reassigns ownership of success and failure. And when that exact framing suddenly appears in a published article praising the very person who allegedly made those remarks while diminishing the one they were directed at, the question becomes unavoidable: how did the reporter know, and who told him, and why then? And the answer to that question leads directly into the most unstable variable in this entire situation, the journalist, whose involvement has become so tangled that even seasoned legal observers are struggling to keep track, because this is not a simple case of reporting a tip. This is a case of a reporter communicating with both sides, appearing in filings, changing sworn statements, and cycling through multiple attorneys in a remarkably short period of time. And none of that signals stability, none of that signals clarity, and none of that signals confidence. And when someone keeps changing legal counsel, it usually means one of two things: either new information keeps emerging that alters their exposure, or previous counsel no longer wants to be associated with what is coming next. And both possibilities raise serious concerns, because this reporter did not just write articles, he became part of the record. His messages were cited, his statements were relied upon, and then walked back, and then reframed again and again and again. And each change makes the previous version harder to reconcile, and each reconciliation harder to believe. And when credibility erodes this way, it does not just affect one person, it affects every narrative thread connected to them, because if the source is unstable, the story becomes unstable too. And that instability is precisely why the sudden hiring of a specialist attorney becomes so telling. Because when stories are about to collapse, you do not hire someone to argue facts, you hire someone to argue framing. And that is exactly what we are seeing unfold in real time, because the messaging now is not focused on specifics. It is focused on identity, it is focused on optics, it is focused on emotional alignment, and it is focused on positioning. And positioning is not evidence, positioning is strategy, and strategy only becomes necessary when outcomes feel uncertain. And this uncertainty is visible not just in legal maneuvering but in commercial fallout as well, because while court battles play out slowly, market reactions happen quietly and sometimes far more brutally. And viewers should pay close attention to what disappears without announcement, because silence often speaks louder than press releases. And when products quietly vanish from shelves, when availability shrinks without explanation, when distribution quietly contracts, those are not accidents, those are responses, and responses usually follow numbers, and numbers do not lie, even when public statements do. And while no single factor can explain everything, patterns once again emerge. And those patterns suggest a brand under strain, a public image under pressure, and a team attempting to hold multiple fronts at once: legal, media, reputational, and financial. And that kind of multitasking rarely happens when confidence is high, it happens when risk is mounting. And the most striking thing about all of this is that it is unfolding while key materials remain Sealed because once those materials surface, the narrative may no longer be controllable. Which explains the urgency, explains the aggressive media posture, explains the symbolic hires, and explains why stories keep surfacing that lean heavily on emotion while remaining light on verifiable detail. And this is not accidental, it is anticipatory. Because when facts are coming, you try to get ahead of them, and that brings us back once again to the meeting that started it all. Because if the foundation of the public story rests on a confrontation that witnesses describe very differently, then everything built on top of that foundation becomes unstable. And once instability sets in, damage control becomes the priority, and damage control does not look like silence, it looks like saturation, it looks like repetition, it looks like association, and it looks like urgency, and that urgency is now visible everywhere you look. And the next phase of this story takes us directly into how that urgency may collide with discovery, because when discovery begins, narratives no longer belong to publicists. They belong to records, and records do not bend for optics. And that is where the story becomes truly unpredictable, and why the next developments could reshape everything viewers think they know. What makes this third phase so critical is that this is where the story stops being about personalities and starts being about consequences. Because once discovery edges closer, once sealed materials loom, once timelines tighten, suddenly every previous public move gets re-examined under a very different light, and actions that once looked confident begin to look preemptive, and statements that once sounded authoritative begin to sound defensive. And that shift is already happening, because more people are now looking back at what was said, when it was said, and who benefited from it. And that retrospective scrutiny is brutal because it strips away emotion and leaves only sequence and motive, and when sequence and motive align too neatly, it becomes uncomfortable. And one of the most uncomfortable elements here is how often attempts were made during sworn questioning to anchor the emotional core of this story to a single justification, and how consistently those attempts failed. Because when lawyers repeatedly try to guide witnesses toward a specific conclusion, and those witnesses decline again and again, that pattern becomes meaningful. Not because of what is said, but because of what is not, and in this case, what was not confirmed was the central justification that had been circulating publicly for months. And that absence now looms larger than any headline, because absence in sworn testimony creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled either by evidence or by doubt. And doubt is already spreading because viewers are noticing how often the narrative relies on implication rather than documentation, how frequently anonymous sourcing replaces verifiable record, and how aggressively emotional framing substitutes for factual specificity. And that substitution is not sustainable once discovery begins. Because discovery does not care how something feels, it cares how something was recorded. And recorded materials have a way of flattening narratives, reducing them to timelines, messages, drafts, edits, approvals, and omissions. And those elements are far less flexible than public memory, and that rigidity is exactly why the current media blitz feels so urgent, because urgency usually means something is about to change, and the people closest to the story seem to know it. Because moves are being made not quietly, but conspicuously, as if visibility itself is meant to be a shield. And that rarely works long-term, because visibility invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites comparison, and comparison exposes inconsistencies. And we are already seeing that process start, because viewers are connecting dots that were never meant to be connected, noticing overlaps in language across outlets, spotting familiar phrasing repeated in different contexts, and questioning how independent those reports truly were. And once that question enters the conversation, it does not leave. Because credibility, once questioned, becomes the lens through which everything else is viewed. And that lens is now being applied not just to statements, but to strategy. And strategy is where the pressure becomes undeniable. Because strategies designed to influence perception before evidence surfaces often collapse when evidence finally appears, and when that collapse happens, it is rarely gentle, it tends to be abrupt and destabilizing. And that possibility explains why certain individuals appear to be repositioning themselves legally. Because when exposure risk changes, legal strategy changes too, and the addition of specialized counsel often signals preparation for a different phase, not an extension of the same one. And that shift suggests anticipation, not confidence, anticipation of testimony, anticipation of cross-examination, anticipation of contradiction, and anticipation of accountability. And accountability is the one thing narratives cannot outrun, no matter how polished. Because at some point stories must align with records, and when they do not, something gives, and historically it is not the record. And this is why the next stage of the situation carries so much weight, because it will determine whether this was a misunderstanding amplified by media, or a carefully managed story now colliding with documentation. And viewers should understand that this distinction matters not just for the people involved, but for how similar stories will be interpreted going forward, because precedent is being set here. Whether intentionally or not, and precedent shapes future credibility and future skepticism and future trust, and that is why every move right now feels like it is happening at double speed, because once materials surface, speed no longer matters, control no longer matters, and messaging no longer matters. Only alignment does, and alignment cannot be manufactured retroactively. And that is why the tension you feel is real, because the window for shaping perception is narrowing. And once it closes, the story will belong to the record, not the narrative. And that moment is approaching faster than many realize. Everything converges into this final phase. What becomes impossible to ignore is that this situation is no longer being driven by a single dispute or a single meeting or even a single narrative. It is being driven by momentum, because momentum, once it starts moving in legal media and public spaces, takes on a life of its own. And right now that momentum is not slowing. It is accelerating, and acceleration usually means impact is coming, because stories like this do not hover indefinitely, they resolve one way or another. And the closer they get to resolution, the more frantic the positioning becomes, and that is exactly what we are witnessing, because every move now feels less like confidence and more like preparation for exposure, preparation for reinterpretation, preparation for consequences. And when preparation replaces certainty, behavior changes, language changes, and priorities change, and those changes are visible everywhere. From how statements are worded to where stories are placed to who is suddenly speaking and who has gone very quiet, because silence in moments like this is rarely accidental. It is calculated, and calculation implies risk assessment, and risk assessment implies vulnerability, and that vulnerability is the thread running through everything now. Because once materials unseal, once timelines are laid out, once communications are contextualized, the story will no longer belong to the loudest voice, it will belong to the most consistent one, and consistency is the one thing that has been hardest to maintain here, because accounts have shifted positions, have softened, explanations have evolved, and witnesses have clarified, corrected, and sometimes contradicted previous impressions. And while evolution is not inherently dishonest, rapid evolution under pressure raises questions, and those questions are multiplying, because viewers are not just watching what is said, they are watching when it is said, and how quickly narratives pivot in response to external developments. And that responsiveness suggests reactivity, not transparency, and reactive narratives struggle. One, scrutiny intensifies, because they are built to respond, not to withstand. And endurance is what matters next, because whatever comes out next will not disappear after a news cycle. It will be archived, it will be cited, and it will be revisited. And that permanence changes everything, because permanent records demand accountability. And accountability does not negotiate with framing. And the most revealing aspect of this entire situation is that so much effort appears to be going into shaping how things feel, rather than clarifying what actually happened. And that imbalance is telling, because clarity benefits truth, confusion benefits control. And control only becomes necessary when outcomes feel uncertain, and that uncertainty is now visible across every layer of the story, from the legal maneuvers to the media strategy to the commercial signals that quietly tell their own story. And when you step back and look at all of it together, the pattern is clear: escalation followed by reinforcement followed by repositioning. And now anticipation, and anticipation is the final stage before revelation, because once revelation occurs, strategy gives way to reaction. And reaction is much harder to manage, and that is why this moment feels suspended, because everyone involved appears to be bracing for the same thing: the moment when speculation ends and documentation begins. And that moment will not be dramatic in the way headlines are dramatic, it will be methodical. It will be procedural, and it will be unforgiving, and once it arrives, it will answer questions that no interview ever could. And until then, what remains is a growing tension between what has been claimed and what has been confirmed. And that tension is what is keeping this story alive, because unresolved contradictions do not fade, they demand resolution, and resolution is coming whether anyone is ready for it or not.